We're good.
Good to use your link. Hello, everyone. Let's go, Caleb. All right, let's go ahead and get started. It's our last event this semester. Hope you guys are all going to enjoy this. I'm actually pretty stoked about this topic in particular. I think this is going to be a very good talk. So I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Hanssen and Dr. Fleck so we can go ahead and get started. Dr. Hanssen is an economist at Clemson University, specializing in institutions, political economy, and industrial organization. He has published articles in a number of well-respected journals, including American Economic Review and Journal of Law and Economics. Dr. Hanssen was also a National Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution in the early 2000s. Dr. Fleck is also a professor of economics at Clemson, with expertise in economic history, development economics, and public finance. His publications span a diverse set of topics, including the New Deal, the role played by the judiciary and democratic forms of government, and the consequences of major economic and political transitions. Dr. Fleck was also a National Fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution in 2010. Dr. Hanssen's favorite economist is Ronald Coase, and Dr. Fleck's favorite economist is Adam Smith. So feel free to go ahead and ask them about that after the event if you guys are interested in them explaining why. So without any further delay, here are Dr. Hanssen and Dr. Fleck on the democratic transition.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for the group for inviting me here. This is a real pleasure. I've heard great things about Hillsdale for many years now, and it's a wonderful opportunity for me to have a chance to actually be here to talk to some Hillsdale students. I should also say that picking a favorite economist is a bit like, saying which of your parents do you like best. I mean, it's not, I'd say that's it's a tough one to do. But, so take my choice advisedly. So what we're going to do today is I'll talk about half the time, and Rob will talk about half the time. And this is, we're going to focus on our own research on ancient Greece, a lot of which relates to this idea of democratic transition. But we're not Greek scholars, we're not classicists, we don't read Greek, we interpret what others have come up with in their own archaeological or literary analyses. So our interest is in the democratic transition broadly, but we think that ancient Greece is a very good place to look for evidence that's, we can apply and understand the modern world and democracy better. And so I'm going to present with that in mind. So our goal is not to understand ancient Greece better per se, though, maybe we contribute a little bit on that front too, but basically to sort of identify some lessons from the modern world. So we'll talk about, in the course of this, if we can fit it all in, we'll talk about 4 of our papers. We've published a number of things on ancient Greece, and we'll sort of try to tie those in the form of lessons for the modern world too. Okay, so the democratic transition. Well, let's start with a real simple question. Why do we care about democracy? Anybody here care about democracy? Yeah, everybody cares about democracy. But why is an interesting question? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Arguably, it's the most successful form of the last 2 centuries. So this is data from Polity. This is a sort of a good source of democracy data. Democracy is blue. And what do we see? We see it creeping up over time so that today it forms, roughly half of all governments out there. So even if you were just sort of indifferent to the merits of a particular system, you say, well, this is sort of interesting. This is one that really seems to have gained in popularity, particularly since 1990. What happened in 1990? Anybody know?
Fall of the Soviet Union.
The fall of the Soviet Union, exactly. So you see a big drop in autocracy, a big climb in democracy. But there are other reasons too. It's associated with good things for citizenship. Higher levels of material well-being, for example. Higher levels of freedom and liberty. I know everybody here cares about that. Now, it's often hard to tell the direction of causality. So is it that democracies are established where, wealth is higher? Is it that democracies are established where liberty is higher? Is it that democracy causes these things? And that's one of the things we try to shed light on a little bit with our research. Despite all apparent advantages of democracy, however, the additional wealth, the additional freedom, the fact that it wins the popularity contest, converting non-democracies to democracies appears to be very difficult. I'm sure everybody here is aware of that. Anyone who reads a newspaper knows it. Furthermore, democracies are not stable even once they're established. In other words, lots of democracies will revert to being non-democracies. I mean, Latin America has a repeated history of democracies reverting. Things that start off promisingly, like the Egyptian Spring, don't work out so well. So basically, understanding how democracies arise or don't, and then how they survive or don't are very important questions. And so, that's really our goal in looking at ancient Greece, okay? So what is democracy? Let's start with that. It's a Greek word, meaning rule by the masses. Demos means sort of the people, more or less. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. So that's what we might think of democracy, from the Gettysburg Address there. Now, Greek institutions of democracy were very different than our modern institutions. They were direct democracies. They ruled through a popular assembly to which all male citizens belong. I'll come back to that. So we can't really define democracy by particular institutions and say, well, it's got these three bodies of government, blah, blah, blah. So we're going to we define democracy very simply. So as far as this talk is concerned, one regime is more democratic than another to the degree that a larger proportion of its population is able to participate in public decision making and thereby influence policy. Okay, and this would hold for direct democracies of ancient Greece, would hold for the representative democracies of today. So for example, aristocracy, you could imagine it's ruled by blood, certain families. That would be a very narrow and very impermeable group. Versus oligarchy, which is ruled by certain wealth levels. That's going to be a broader and more permeable group. Versus democracy, which is going to be broader still. So if we're talking about a transition to democracy, it would be from one of these more narrow rules to a broader rule. And particularly when we look at ancient Greece, we're not really going to have much more information about the institutions than that, with the exception of a few very famous city-states, such as Athens. Okay, so transition to democracy thus entails an expansion of policy-making rights from a narrower to a broader. So that's what we're thinking of when we talk about democracy. Okay? So far, so good? Well, why ancient Greece? Okay, well, it's the birthplace of democracy. Democracy, of course, is a Greek word, as I just said. Well, if you're interested in the transition to democracy, the first several hundred transitions were in ancient Greece. And so therefore, it seems like a logical place to look. There is an important caveat. Only men were enfranchised. Women did not have political rights. The Greeks owned slaves, okay? So we keep that in mind throughout. In this, they were very much like the United States and, up until the time of the Civil War and beyond for the enfranchisement of women. But they were also very successful. And they were not only the birthplace of democracy, but they weren't sort of democracy appearing in some little society that, it's like it's a little curiosity and then they disappear. They continue to influence Western thought to this very day. But they were also, and this is, I think, a little bit underappreciated, they were a highly commercial society. They were very sophisticated contracts. They engaged in long-distance trade. They produced all kinds of things. You could buy thousands of different products in the Athenian marketplace. I mean, it was really quite extraordinary. And the level of wealth, the per capita level of wealth had been estimated to be roughly, in ancient Athens, was estimated to be roughly similar to that of an English person, a British citizen, or a citizen of the Netherlands around the year 1700. So this is a fairly wealthy, fairly well-to-do society. It's also an excellent laboratory. Those of you who've taken any statistics or econometrics know that one of the difficulties if you're trying to tease out, why, for example, some countries do one thing and other countries do another, is that countries differ in a whole slew of ways. And when you can control for these things, that's great. But often you can't. These things are going to be unobservable. Well, there's less to control for because the Greek city-states were more comparable. They're more similar. They spoke the same language. They had, the same history. They had, to some degree. They had similar religion to some degree. In addition, they're a very successful set of states. So if we're interested, think about this from a survival perspective. There's a lot of interstate competition. Greece back then, as all of you probably know, it wasn't a country. It was a sort of a broad territory, and I'll come back to that, defined by a common language and this common history. And those states that survived basically by fighting off neighbors or taking over neighboring Greek states, and very paths to democracies. And that's something more we'll talk about. So it's a great laboratory with one small shortcoming, which is there's not a lot of data. Okay, so it's great in principle. In practice, we just don't know that much. However, new sources of data are emerging. There's been an inventory published that actually lists constitutions for a couple of hundred city-states, very crude, very broad, at the level of oligarchy, democracy, tyranny, and we make use of that. We know a fair bit about ancient Athens. But even there, what we know is tiny as compared to the things we know about, any modern country in the world today. Maybe China, except. Okay, so when we talk about ancient Greece, we have to keep that in mind. What we know is very limited. And of course, Rob and I are taking what we know from what the Classics is. So just to give you a bit of background, when we talk about ancient Greece, people usually have this period in mind, dating from the collapse of Mycenaean civilization, a Bronze Age palace economy, up until the death of Alexander the Great. And this is basically the period of the city-state. The city-state develops sometimes, or begins to develop during the Dark Age, is fully coalesced by the Archaic period. With the death of Alexander the Great, it more or less disappears. The successors to Alexander, the cities survive, but the successors to Alexander sort of take away a lot of the policy responsibilities of these areas, so they're no longer what they were before. So it's really this period here, and of course the classical period is what most people are familiar with. That was when the Parthenon was built, and Pericles lived, and the Peloponnesian War was fought, and a lot of the things you hear about. But the polis are really, this is a very interesting period here, because this is when the polis formed, the Greek states, that is to say, polis means city-state. Typically it was one central city with maybe some satellite cities and some area of farmland. Could be as small as maybe a population of 1,000 people. Could be as large as Athens, which would have had maybe 250,000 people or so. But they were not big states by the standards of nation state today. But they start coalescing here. That's when they reintegrate themselves into local trading networks. There was sort of a period of warming climate that really made this, or cooling climate that made this, the Greek area much more agriculturally productive. That's behind us. That's sort of beyond what we're going to talk about right now. But this is the period we're going to be talking about, and one reason it's a great laboratory is if we go back to the Dark Age, basically we've got aristocracies everywhere. By the mid-Archaic period, these have been converted into oligarchies, in other words, ruled by blood to ruled by wealth. And by the Classical period, we have democracy in many places, okay? But we still have some oligarchies, we still have some autocracies called tyrannies, so it gives us a lot of comparison. We have changes over time, we have cross-sectional differences, so it's ideal from that perspective. Okay, so it's a great laboratory for exploring political rights. And this is no small potatoes. If we look at this map right here, all of these red boxes are places identified as Greek polis. And you can see they span as far west as the coast of Spain, up in the Black Sea area, down to the coast of Africa. And they're concentrated particularly around the Aegean, both on the coast of what was called Anatolia, but it's primarily Turkey today, and this would be modern Greece. Okay, so this was a very widely distributed, very successful civilization. Okay, so we're going to address two questions. One, what promotes the transition to democracy, and that's what I'll talk about. And then I'll pass the baton to Rob, who'll talk about what makes democracy durable. In other words, once you transition, what makes it last. And again, we're going to just talk about our own research in this field, but our own research, of course, builds on research by a slew of other scholars. So important to keep that in mind. Now, we're going to talk about different models. So when we think about these problems, as economists, we lay out a model. What's a model? A model is a simplification of a complicated world intended to isolate a particular factor that we're interested in. And that's the purpose of a model, okay? Common factors to our models, we assume rational actors, okay? So we assume that people are rationally evaluating the benefits and costs of alternative action. It doesn't mean they're omniscient, it doesn't mean they're omnipotent, it just means that they're thinking, they're forward thinking. The issue of commitment is front and center. We talked a bit about this at dinner time, but you have to be able to commit to whatever institutions you're thinking about. In other words, you have to somehow be able to lock it in a way that will become clearer as we talk about this. And our sort of broad modeling approach is political institutions as contracts. This is a way to think about it. And again, it's not that we would imagine the aristocrats and the demos sitting down at the table together and sort of hashing out how they want the system to work. But as a modeling device, that's how we lay it out so we can isolate particular factors. And it's, alternatively, we could just think about, survival. We could think, okay, it doesn't matter. Things are scattered about randomly. Where does democracy survive? Where does it thrive? Where does it not survive? And it takes us to the same place. So we should think of this as a modeling device. We're not trying to paint a realistic picture of what the Greeks did, though in some circumstances it may be a realistic picture, particularly when we're dealing with sophisticated people like the Athenians, okay? So what promotes a transition to democracy? We can restate that in terms of our definition of democracy. Why would a narrower group expand control of policy making to a broader group? Why would an aristocracy say, wow, yes, let's let those people over there vote, okay? Well, we could imagine a few reasons. There's a popular one, would be revolution, right? Okay. Okay, allons enfants, everybody join. Basically, so this would be the idea, you take the barricades, justice triumphs, and it's hard to think of any instances where this has ever led to a durable democracy, okay? In France, what did it lead to? It led to Napoleon I. Democracy was reinstituted, then what did it lead to? It led to the next Napoleon. So it's a romantic idea. It's hard to think of any instance where it actually happened. Now our group becomes enlightened. This is sort of the idea of progress. We become wealthier, and then we realize, wait a second, we should let these other people. We should let women vote. We should let these other people vote. We could just, look at this is not the way to live. Come on now. Well, it's not to say things like that don't matter, but think of survival. Think of regimes that have to survive in a competitive environment. It doesn't matter how enlightened they are. If they've got a form of government that does not fit their circumstances, they're not going to survive. And if they have whether it's a democracy or something else. So whatever they think is less important than whether that fits, whether they can solve the commitment problem, whether it solves the problem that the society faces. And I think that will be a little clearer as I talk further. And this is sort of the basis of our model, not just our model. I think a number of models, Acemoglu and Robinson, if anyone has heard of their stuff, a number of other people have written, but the basic idea is that the expansion of right is in the interest of someone, it's in the interest of that narrow group for some reason or other. And I'm going to focus here on improving incentive for productive activity, okay? In other words, so let's talk about that. So how would democracy improve incentive for productive activity? This is the first paper we published on ancient Greece back in 2006. So here's our model. Imagine two players, two actors in this model. Two parties participating. The aristocrat, who sets tax rate, and the demos, which engages in some kind of productive activity. So that you can think of the demos as out growing stuff, and the aristocrat is then taxing it, okay? Each faces a decision. The aristocrat decides whether to retain control of tax rates or pass control to the demos. Okay, in other words, the aristocrat at the start has full control of tax rates. And it doesn't have to. It can say, okay, I'm going to give you, the demos, control of tax rates. The demos is deciding whether to make an unobservable investment at some cost, which will raise output in future periods. This unobservable is key. This means that the aristocrat can't say to the demos, look at, you make this investment, or I'm going to have my soldiers cut your head off, because the aristocrat can't observe that. Now, what kind of effort might be unobservable? Anybody have any idea? How about how hard you're working on your paper? Can the professor observe that? He can observe your paper and maybe make a judgment from that paper, but he can't observe how hard you're working. Okay? And that would be the idea. Okay? So there's going to be some unobservable investment. It is productive. It will raise output by more than it costs, but the aristocrat can't tell whether the demos have done it. So there are two possible outcomes. The aristocrat retains control of tax rates, maintains narrow rule, in other words, does not expand to a democracy, and the demos does not undertake the unobservable investment. Why not? Because the demos knows that if it does produce extra at some cost, the aristocrat will tax it all the way, will take it all the way. So the demos has no incentive to make that investment because it's not going to keep it. Okay? But that's good for the aristocrat to the degree that now the aristocrat owns the whole pie. But it could be a bigger pie if the demos took that investment, but there's nothing that the aristocrat can do while it maintains control of tax rates to get that investment. Alternatively, the aristocrat can pass control of taxes to the demos, i.e. establish a democracy, and then the demos undertakes the investment because now the demos is going to be the one that sets the tax rate. What does it mean for the aristocrat? Well, it means the aristocrat can no longer take everything that's produced above some certain minimum level that's necessary to keep the demos there. But the pie is bigger. So the question is this smaller chunk of a bigger pie bigger than what the aristocrat would get by itself? Well, that depends. It depends on how big is this unobservable investment. Okay, and so the prediction in this model is democracy gets established where the potential increases in wealth from the unobservable investment are highest. Okay? All right. Well, let's test this model. I mean, the purpose of a model is to test, is to provide a prediction for testing. So that's our prediction. And the test is comparing classical Athens, which you could think of in some ways the most democratic of the city-states of the classical period, versus classical Sparta, we could think of as the least democratic. I mean, we're being a bit loose with that, but the classical Sparta was very narrow in its rule. It was sort of an aristocracy that ruled over a large group of agricultural serfs, is one way to think about it. Classical Athens, everybody was enfranchised. The agricultural sector was fully enfranchised. Okay? Well, whenever you want to test something, you need something exogenous. In other words, if we're interested in something causing democracy, we can't have something that in itself caused by democracy. We need something that sort of either predates or is somehow independent of democracy, and so all we go with is different terrain. So Athens and Sparta are located in different landscapes. Early in the archaic period, as far as we know, their political systems did not differ. They were both narrow aristocracies, more or less the same kind of structure. Okay. Sparta took over in a violent battle in neighboring territory, and as a result, they ended up with these very, very fertile plains. Very large, very fertile plains, perfect for growing grain, versus Athens. Anyone ever been to Greece? Yeah. What does Athens look like? Is it a fertile plain? Very, yeah, sort of hilly, somewhat rocky. Okay, so in other words, this would be Sparta. Looking down on Sparta, these beautiful fields, perfect for growing grain. This is Athens. I mean, that's a particularly rocky point of Athens. Not all that. But basically, it means different crops. Okay, grain on the homogeneous flatland of Sparta, and grain was a staple diet of the Greeks, so that was very valuable. Olives. That became the main sort of trading crop for the Athenians. Now, olives actually grow just fine on the hillsides. And the hillsides, it wasn't that the soil was bad, it was just that it was very hilly, you know, you had to maybe landscape a bit, but it grew olives just fine. Okay, so far so good? Well, think about the investment that each involves. Is there anything unobservable for the wheat production? Can I tell how hard, and so I've got a serf producing wheat for me, can I tell how hard that serf has worked? Well, I could watch the serf, but I got lots of them out there, that's taken a lot of time, or I could just observe how much wheat is grown. Or it's actually barley, I think, but how much grain is grown. If I see that for one particular serf, there's a lot less grain grown than for the neighboring serfs, what do I know? If I see that this year's growth is a lot less than last year's growth, and I haven't noticed any big change in the weather, what do I know? So I can deduce the level of effort from that, okay? So I can get all that grain without granting any kind of political rights, because I can do that through threats of violence, basically, okay? How about olive trees? They take a dozen years to grow. Am I going to tell people, you go up there, and if you don't put in the right amount of effort to plant those olive trees, 12 years from now, you're in big trouble. So think about that, but also think about the fact that every olive tree's yield is going to depend on, you know, the slope at that particular point where the olive tree is planted, the amount of sun it particularly gets as compared to the trees nearby, the amount of runoff from the rain it gets in that particular spot. In other words, you are not going to be able to deduce how hard somebody worked on those trees from the output, the way you can with the grain. What does that mean? Well, it means that somebody who's, you know, a hired hand who's put there to grow olives, what are they going to do? They can shirk. They don't have to put in the optimal amount of effort because you can't tell. The aristocrat can't tell. They can't use violence against them because it won't work. They can't tell who has worked hard and who hasn't, so any form of punishment is useless. What do you do in that kind of situation? How can you get the good incentives? What do you think? How could I give this olive farmer the right incentives to put in the optimal amount of effort? Anybody have any idea?
If the olive farmer is the one who will be benefiting from how hard they work.
Absolutely. And how do I do that? I give them the ownership of the land. And in order to make the ownership of the land credible, you got to give them the property. You got to give them, if you were going to give them property, you got to give them political rights. because you can't own the land at this period of time without being part of the policy-making process, okay? So here, you could get a great increase in wealth from granting property rights, credible property rights, which require granting political rights. In Sparta, yeah, you get some olive trees grown, but that was going to be relatively small compared to the value of this wheat crop, okay? So all the production's costed a lot, or wheat isn't, therefore different incentives to grant farmers, those who worked the land, residual claims, and basically Sparta never did. Sparta had serfs its whole time, and Sparta was a very narrow rule by this aristocracy because the agricultural sector was never enfranchised. Athens did. The farmers were sort of the core of the citizen, okay? So different assignment of political rights. Athens was a democracy, Sparta was an oligarchy, okay? We also, in this paper, look at Athens over time. We also look at a small cross-section of states. I won't talk about those. See the article if you're interested. But basically, we found sort of consistent evidence. So that's the basic idea. You get this kind of return, it gives you the incentive to expand rights. Okay, consistent with the prediction, the probability of granting rights rises with returns to costly the monetary investment. Okay, well, so far, nice and cute, right? So is there any implications for the modern world? Well, what do we know? Democracy has risen dramatically in the last 150 years or so. Any changes in returns to valuable but costly to monitor investment? Can anyone think of anything that's very valuable today? What's the most valuable form of investment in the world today?
Gold.
No, it's worth more than gold. And you're doing it right this second.
Education.
Education, what economists call human capital. That's the most valuable thing in the world today is human capital. Well, how do you get people to invest in human capital? I can't order you to. I can't say, if you don't invest in your human capital, I'm going to lock you up because I can't observe how hard you're investing. I mean, I can see how much time you spend with an economics book in front of you, right? I can see how you do on the test, but that doesn't tell me how much you're really investing. Does that explain the spread of democracy? I don't know. I think it's an interesting conjecture. It could help explain why democracies are wealthier than non-democracy. The model also predicts that wealth per se doesn't lead to democracy. It depends on the circumstances. It's the circumstances in our model, in the case of ancient Athens and ancient Greece, the nature of the terrain leads to different incentives, and that leads to democracy. You don't have that kind of simple story, but it does maybe shed some light on the resource curse. And we talk about that in our paper. I won't go into that now. Anybody know who these people are? This is actually a painting. I think it's by Chardin. I could be wrong about that. I should have looked before I got here. It's hard to see. These are naked young men. These are somewhat naked young women. How about this guy? These are the Spartans, okay? And Rob and I wrote a paper on the ancient Sparta, rulers ruled by women, the rise and fall of women's rights in ancient Sparta. So Sparta was one of the most repressive regimes in ancient Greece. We take it from the perspective of the serfs. If you were going to be a woman citizen, a woman married to a citizen in any of the Greek city-states, Sparta was a place you wanted to be. Women were as well educated as the males, maybe better educated. They exercised in public, in the nude, so this is somewhat lifelike, I guess, in that respect. And they also, because Sparta was organized to basically maintain this captive land it had, the men spent full time in basically the army, is a way to think about it. They lived in barracks, they trained constantly. Well, who supervised the agricultural land? Who supervised these serfs? Who made decisions about breeding of the cattle and the harvesting of the grain and whatever it was that farmers do? Well, it was the women. How do you get women to have good incentives? You grant the property rights just like men, okay? And so that's the idea. I'm simplifying it a little bit, but that's basically the idea. So, the other Greeks wrote a lot about the women of ancient Sparta. They found them pretty fascinating, okay? And, but that's really, I think they had these unique inheritance rules where women own property. So, again, it's a human capital type of thing related to unobservable investment. How do the men could just have ordered the women, hey, you monitor, okay? How do you tell? How can you tell if they're monitoring? And the argument's a little more subtle than that, but I'm sort of short of time right now, so I will stop. So I think it's time to pass over to Rob, who will continue from here.
Well, just quickly say thanks. We really appreciate the invitation out here. It's been really fun so far. So the question here that we want to go after is what makes democracy durable? you can also say, if you can get democracy, how do you make it stick? And also, make it work decently. This has long been a concern. At the U.S. founding, there were doubts how it all would work, not just in Europe, but also amongst Americans. And if you think the bigger picture here, it's a reason to doubt that it would always work smoothly. Was it a real big bloody civil war? Really, hindsight, not that long after constitutional stuff and stuff. Also, you look around the world today. There's a lot of failed efforts at democratization. Some, such as Venezuela, they set things up. Others, they don't quite get them set up, even though some people were trying to set up a democracy. Or like Arab Spring, sometimes you can get democracy. Also, it doesn't work that well. So here's a question. Is it the case that just some places are unsuitable for democracy, whereas others are? So perhaps, at least parts of ancient Greece, they were well suited to democracy, and other parts it's just hopeless. Well, that's kind of depressing. Maybe there's some truth there, but that's not what we worked on. we're more interested in, can voters commit to avoid bad outcomes? And this is kind of tough because what the voters did promise that future voters won't vote badly. There's two mechanisms we consider. So one is that if there's some problem with getting voters coordinated to vote well and align their incentives, maybe there's some costly things the voters can do to get alignment on some of the key issues. And just to keep in mind here, economists like to talk about outcomes that are second best. There's the ideal outcome that if you didn't have to worry about incentives and information problems and things like that you just set up and do. But oftentimes you're choosing among definitely imperfect outcome, and the perfect option isn't there. So we want to know if we look at costly things voters can do, so they're not free, but they align incentives. And another is voters can constrain themselves with the rule of law. Of course, part of the difficulty there is even if people know that, can you necessarily easily set up a rule of law and then commit to stick with it, and that might require you to incur some costs. So these are some charts that we find really interesting. By the way, don't take too much of these. These are just the sort of cobbled together, as Andy mentioned, from this inventory of Greek city-states. But this is ancient democracies. Democracies in blue, and sort of the number of democracies. This is some of the iffiest data you ever come across. But these data, we think they are useful. There's something going on here. Well, one thing you do see is there's this rise in democracy over time. You also see that in the modern world. And so this is looking at basically from 1800-ish till now. You see, and this is similar to some of the charts that we saw earlier. Here's another way to look at this. The proportion of failing democracy, not just the growth over time, but there's a fair number of democracies there that aren't lasting to the next interval. By the way, and just to be clear too, those intervals are a little hard to cobble together too, but that's our best shot at that. And the modern world. We see countries go from democracy to non-democracy also. But whether it's for the same mechanisms or different, I think that's a very interesting question that something we cannot answer. But here's something, again, we want to look at some general principles that might illuminate Greece, and also let us look at Greece, figure out how the Greeks set up what they did, and then think if that's also works in the modern world. And so we have a paper with a theoretical model, and it was discussed at dinner. We've been for years trying to figure out how to get this simple enough to work. But I'll say a bit about that in a bit. But Aristotle is probably more concise, so we'll do that. So he says that the private land, part should be near the border, and the other part near the city, so that each citizen having two lots, all of them have land in both places. So the key thing here is that if you think about your incentives for border wars, and by the way, we model this as a public good provision, but this is some generic public good. But defense is obviously the one that matters, because if your neighbors clobber you, you don't have a place anymore. But this idea is if you have people in the city center, and they've got land there, but nothing on the border, they're not so concerned with raids on the border. If you have people on the border, they may want a lot of effort into defending the border and even expand it in neighboring territories. So you're not going to get, if you have people with land in different places, they'll have different incentives when they're going to vote for the use of, say, if it's land, the infantry. However, if everyone owns a plot on the frontier and a plot near the city, they own both, then incentives are aligned. We, posit that there's trade-offs faced by all democracies. One thing you can do is you can limit specialization of trade, like Aristotle was suggesting, and you get alignment of voters over at least some things. And so when you go to vote on use of the military, people agree, and you're well aligned. That's what models the public good. However, you can also, the alternative here is you promote more specialization in trade that generates wealth. And if you're going to be a wealthy economy, you really don't want to go with Aristotle's suggestion. But the problem here is that it may come at the cost of lack of agreement on policy. And so that's what we're looking at. So in terms of how this works for Greece, Sparta did the former. So Andy's part there, mentioned that all the Spartans were expected to own estates. The girls all went to public school. Were supposed to grow up to be women, to marry a man who was a full-time soldier who went off to boot camp at age 6 and all had the same training. So incredibly homogeneous society. We'll get to a slide I'll mention a little bit more in a second. Athens, though, had enormous specialization and developed a very wealthy economy, as we mentioned, but that comes at a cost. Okay? So just think of the durability by design. So all Spartan men could vote. So in Andy's part, Spartan is an aristocracy. Now they're a democracy for this. You just think about the voting rights are very egalitarianly allocated amongst the Spartan men. So very equal political rights. They were all full-time soldiers, so they all shared in the cost of war. They're all, we're exaggerating a little bit, but that's a pretty good approximation. They all owned Helot-worked estates, and the Helots were attached to the land, so they all owned assets, and they weren't allowed to trade. So everybody had relatively homogeneous holdings of land. Also, commercial activities were extremely restricted. So you couldn't just go be an entrepreneur. You were a soldier. Just like the documentary 300 that Andy showed you a picture of, the Spartan also. If you've seen it, there's battle rhinos in there. It may have a little bit of a weak historical foundation. But the homogeneity and sharing the cost and benefits, that aligned the incentives for use of the military. Remember, that is the key thing for Sparta's existence. But it was costly because they did not get the gains of specialization. So what did Athens do? Well, all Athenian men eventually could vote. It took a while to do that. So they got specialization, generated a lot of wealth, but they also used rules to reduce the misalignment costs. These weren't perfect, so they're going to have misalignment, and they're going to disagree over some of the uses of the Navy. But the Navy is key for Athens, for their empire. But the rowers were paid, so they're not conscripting, the poor Athenian men and saying, go row, or, they're paid to do that. Also, the triremes, which are their warships, which were really expensive, super high tech, so think like a carrier group or something. Anyway, these are really interesting ships, very expensive to outfit. The wealthy Athenians outfitted them. So the wealthy are bearing a large cost, financial cost. So Athens flourished, but they did have some disagreements that were serious over the use of the Navy. It's actually very interesting history. Skip over that, so make sure we have some time for discussion. And also, they eventually established a rule of law that constrained their majorities. And the key factor we want to emphasize is in the model's alignment. So it's not wealth inequality, that you're getting rid of that. Remember, Aristotle is saying you own 2 pieces of land, right? So if you own a small plot on the frontier, a small plot in the city, and your friend owns a big plot in the city and a big plot on the frontier, you're pretty well aligned, especially if your costs that your share of the cost for the military is proportional to your asset holdings. You're going to have pretty good agreement on use of the military. And the version of the model that we've now worked out is we're just assuming complete wealth equality, and you still get the alignment. Okay, so what are the implications? And this is I think that so far we've been quick with Greek history. We'll even be faster with American history. It is found that the U.S. has had a line of challenges. If we go with what we argue everyone does, you want a democracy, you got to figure this out. Notice, unlike Sparta, it would have been completely impractical to try and allocate land in any kind of way to align incentives, right? Even, the colonies, these were huge, right? And so there's no way you're going to have everyone with, some plot in Boston and some plot in Michigan or something like that. The other issue is captive labor. So the United States has a large slave population. And you're not going to say, okay, all voters, you have to enslave someone or something like that. It does not make any economic sense whatsoever, even if you had no objection morally to slavery, right? It's just slaves are highly productive in some uses where you can monitor them, something like the Helots in Sparta. So what you're going to wind up with is you get some costly disagreement. So there was, so reading on this, there was seems to be substantial heterogeneity in views of use of the military on the frontier in the U.S. People on the frontier generally wanted more defense of the frontier and more expansion. But of course, the obvious thing is the Civil War. You want to find an example of misalignment of use of the military, it's using the military to shoot at the military. But notice if this is something, there's no Spartan solution. Also, the United States has a lot of specialization in trade. It's a little bit more mundane than the Civil War. But you also just compare, because we think this is also relevant to you think about the way the Athenians managed things. If you compare stimulus spending today, and I think this, Andy and I noticed this with the Great Recession, is it's suddenly this really partisan, polarizing issue, right? If this is really about, trying to smooth out the troughs, and stuff, there shouldn't be so partisan. However, it didn't, something like the Affordable Care Act, it's pretty obvious why that might be a partisan issue. But if you have a federal income tax system that has zero rates for a lot of people, you've suddenly got something that's very un-Athenian in a sense. So you've got costs paid by one group, benefits received by another. And that's our point, is the Greeks worked really hard to avoid situations like that. That obviously didn't do a perfect job, but they were trying. Something like the New Deal was very much something for everybody. So it's, like it or not, it was engineered, parts of it were engineered to last. Right? Parts of it got found unconstitutional really promptly, but other parts like Social Security, boy, is that terrible. So, rule of law, let's even go quick on this. Parts of rule of law, it's well recognized. This is, I'm guessing you're familiar with this. So you've got trade-offs. I'll just, go on and set this up. There's an endogenous choice here, right? There's costs and benefits of establishing the rule of law. Okay. The benefits are pretty obvious, I think, to most of us today, including protecting property rights and just stopping people from doing bad things, to you. But there are costs. It constrains what rulers can do, including the demos when there's something really important. It might be not constitutional. It may slow you down. So the Athenians, so we have a paper on this. We sort of point out that there's benefits and costs. Roughly, as I, just pointed out, Aristotle, as often as the case, had something useful to say. So, but he's arguing, well, I should be the sovereign, not person to rule. Plato, where the good king rules, laws and obstacles stand in the way of justice. So there's your trade-off, ancient Greek style. In the 5th century, we're characterizing Athens as a tribute empire. So prior to the Peloponnesian War, they're collecting tribute from all their allies. By the way, they collect tribute from their allies, and if their allies don't give them tribute, they whack them. Okay? So they've got a very powerful navy that is very useful for stopping pirates, keeping trade going, and making sure everyone pays. But it's large cost to the entire citizenry if they didn't adjust the shocks. So they have, it's called a radical democracy. It's just majority rule. If the majority votes for something today, tomorrow they change their mind, you just change it, vote the other way. So they did not have what we would consider much like our modern rule of law. In a sense, they had a rule that, they voted on stuff and they stuck with that. But it wasn't the case that they had a well-founded constitution. Our argument in the paper is that the small costs from, deviating from whatever was optimal, just because of the nature of the system. People were pretty well aligned. So they didn't have a rule of law, unchecked assembly. The 4th century, they have a commercial empire. They're no longer collecting tribute. And you want to be Athens and have a thriving port, lots of people coming in to trade, get lots of mutual gains from exchange, and make lots of wealth from that. You better commit to property rights and contracts, including with people who are not Athenians. And to commit to that, you can't just have Athenians voting on stuff, because 51% of them, they decide to do something that's going to be very harmful for some of the others, Athenians, that are trying to engage in long contracts. So they basically establish a rule of law to get the and check the assembly, like we do a constitution. In Athens, the key thing here is Athens thrived in both centuries. For the modern world, real quickly, rule of law looks like it matters. I just sort of figure rule of law seems to be really to income growth and such. But is that, as Andy mentioned, from the value of human capital? So the key thing here is, when we're looking at that, we predict the rule of law will be more likely under an autocrat when it would be useful to have the rule of law than it would not be. So if you've got some source of wealth, like oil fields, you can get without establishing rule of law, then it's less likely to establish it. Someplace like Singapore, rule of law, without democracy. A couple of last thoughts. Is it feasible to engineer prosperity? Asamoah Robinson's Why Nation Failed, that did, great book, but we disagree on some things. They basically say you can't engineer prosperity. It's a little bit of an unfair caricature, but our point is Athens and Sparta did. The very important thing is they did it in a different way. So they didn't do it the same way. So the main lessons would be, I think, institutions as commitment devices, part of the way you might see democracy rise and rule of law. You have to commit to the institutions. The other thing is durable democracies, they have good institutions, but those institutions are matched to their circumstances. So it's not necessarily the same good institutions out there. That's it.
We have some time for a Q&A if anyone has any questions or bones or fights they want to take.
Feel free to disagree. We can't possibly be right on it.
That thing you said about modern America and stimulus payments and all that was really fascinating. The whole lecture was great, thank you. But could you go into that a little bit more, particularly the fact that our two political parties roughly align with urban versus rural interests, and Republicans rural, Democrats urban, and where do you see that going in the near future?
Oh, that's a great question. One of our current projects, we've got a county level data set of electoral outcomes looking back for the last 100+ years. And so I think it's complicated. It's a really interesting question. So very roughly, I think we've done some work before, sort of looking at changes in long-run changes in policy, including in the domain. I've done some work on the political economy deal, but you wind up with these the alignments like the urban versus rural. When you're aligned like that, it certainly has an influence on how the representatives that are elected vote, and there's sort of partisan divisions, but there's so much law going on. However, how that got, how we got to this current situation is also just a really complicated process. And so if you look back, sort of 1920s, the Democrats dominate the South and are very weak elsewhere. And now you look at the map of the United States, and you see the Democratic strongholds with a couple islands in the middle, and then it's all red in terms of square miles. So I think that's an interesting question. Whether that so if you sort of think about this, the alignment here, I do think that explains some of the issues, like why are the Democrats trying to undo the limit on the state and local taxes and deductibility. It's like, well, that's certainly a big tax break for high-income people. But I think that's something that's a relatively, probably a new alignment based on that geography. But what we're currently trying to do is sort out what was causing what to go which way. And so very loosely, we think of some of that as just sort of what's happened is there's now, unlike say 100+ years ago, there's now a big federal government party and a small federal government party, right. And that's changed over time. So I think that what that does for the stimulus here is it's not going to be the case that all Republican voters are aligned on that, and it's not the case that all Democratic voters are aligned. But because of, as you point out, because of the geographical division, the way that's going to work is the Republicans will basically have a log roll on policies that are almost all going to be, most of them are going to vote anti-stimulus because of the way the costs go. Whereas the Democrats, because of their geography, even though not all Democrats are going to be in favor of stimulus spending, it's going to be because of their geography, the log roll that they put together for their party positions. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, but anyway, maybe in another year or two we'll have a better answer based on data. Yes?
So you talked about the sort of tension between alignment of interests and specialization. Would you say that once established, a democracy sort of promotes specialization? And if it does it sort of contain like the seeds of its own destruction in that case? Like if by promoting some sort of specialization, it then causes a divergence in interests that then push us away from democracy because now we don't have that alignment that you talked about?
Yeah, I wouldn't be too pessimistic in the sense that, it doesn't, I don't think just because a democracy develops and allows a lot, and fosters a lot of specialization, I think our models would suggest that means is there's always a trade-off there, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's becoming a more pernicious trade-off over time. I think it depends on what the sources of growth are, and so if you have a large group of people that may not have much wealth, but they see a lot of potential gains from policies that are also going to have potential gains for a vast majority of people. People may have a very strong pro-growth group, but sort of the risk there would be if you had a large group of people that sort of see reallocating wealth as more profitable for them personally than creating new wealth. Then I think that's where you have the problem. But I think that's going to depend in part on just technological advances and also some kind of side payments. I mean, the Athenians with the tribute were using that to provide goods that everyone shared in, public buildings and things like that. So if the increases in wealth are shared broadly, you may have a very broad group of people interested in that. Of course, for economists, sharing broadly doesn't mean necessarily that we're going to find people that made a lot of money, take their money and hand it out to other people. A lot of this is, get a set of policies and property rights rules that allow a broad segment of society to benefit from those rules.
And actually, just to add slightly to that, the Spartans were very unanimous in just about everything. They would vote about going to war, and there might be some disagreement, but for the most part, they were very well aligned. The Athenians were not. Their assemblies were very, very rambunctious a lot of the time. Athenians, like Plato, they worried about demagogues and whether this was going to result in tyranny, and whether this Athenian system was stable because it survived all these bad men who were getting these followers and making all these false claims and blah, blah, blah. And the fact is the Athenian democracy was just as durable as the Spartan system. Okay, it worked for those circumstances. So it depends on how you set it up. And so you have to sort of distinguish between whenever you allow the specialization like that, I guess you would say you are putting up with more differences, and therefore you're naturally going to get more disagreements in a democratic marketplace. That doesn't mean that society is necessarily less stable or democracy has necessarily got the seeds of its own destruction. That's going to depend on the nature of the institutions. What is certainly true is the Athenian, as Rob talked about, they did establish something that looks a lot like a modern rule of law after they lost this empire.
After they really messed up.
Yeah, after they lost the Peloponnesian War, in essence. But that was, they lost their empire, they lost their main source of funds. And we shouldn't think about this empire as, like the Roman Empire. I mean, to some degree it was a set of allies. An alternative way to think about the Athenian Empire was that, these allies were helping fund Athens' navy because Athens was the police force for the region and promoted trade, kept the Persians at bay and so forth. And when, and Athens would respond when someone refused to pay by basically going in and saying, okay, fine, well, we're taking over your treasury, more or less. The Peloponnesian War, changed a lot of things. So, but in any case, what they did after they came back was they said that system, that was fine for the circumstances then, but we need something that's going to promote commitment better now, given our current circumstances, given that we're no longer aligned the way we were with regard to this empire. So now we're going to set up constraints on ourselves, and that's really what they did. And that's what we have, and so we've got a bunch of constraints on ourselves, and I think that they're, as long as we stick to our system has proven pretty robust. If it could survive, the slavery and the Civil War, it can survive a lot of things. So I would think that specialization per se doesn't necessarily make us less aligned, but history will tell.
As more men, Athenian men, were given the franchise, was the land requirement dropped? It's kind of like similar to American society.
Yeah, there was a wealth requirement basically that translated into land, so it was exactly that. And yeah, and that's more or less what happened going into the as the 5th century proceeded. So Athens was, I don't know if they were absolutely unique. I've not been able to get a straight answer on that. It may have been the only Greek polis where the landless, basically the laborers and craftsmen, had equal political rights. And, our explanation for that was that they were doing very, very valuable things. Even the very landless, who were maybe just laborers, they were rowing the ships. That was the source of Athens' power. So those were people that, in a certain sense, they had very good incentives for voting as to the use of the Navy, since they got the benefits, they were paid, but they also bore the costs. And so, there were reasons to bring them in, but the answer is yes. They started off with a fairly narrow democracy defined by wealth, and they increasingly expanded over time. And so in that sense, it was a bit like what happened in the United States.
There were a lot of intricacies in the way they set the rules. And so, like the Spartans were principally an infantry fighting as hoplites, and so the Athenian landowners, were also hoplites. They were the infantry, and they paid for their own gear, which was very expensive. So that was what if you were an upper middle class, whatever that means, Athenian, that's what the men would have been doing. But so you would have been risking your life in war and providing your own equipment. People that didn't have that wealth, they were rowers, but they were compensated. So it really did, they really did try and. It looks to us like they tried to align the share of the benefits from using the Navy into the share of the costs, more or less.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, I appreciated the talk. Question is going back to the comparison, geographic connection between Athens and Sparta, wheat and olives. One thing that, did you guys take a look at the differences or the relationship between your ports structure? Athens is known as a trading port, Sparta is not. And is that at all related to the kind of system that would have developed, another geographical input?
Yes.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that Athens was sort of blessed with that port that made it, a great spot to be the sort of the center of trade in the Aegean. But there was really nothing inevitable about Athens port playing that role. And if you go back, to the archaic period of the century before, Athens was one of a number of commercial states that were sort of jockeying for that position. And so I think Athens got it through the dint of their, success in building a navy, some luck, some this and that. It's always hard to tell what all the factors are. But they basically, it was the system that undergirded that. So I guess I would say the harbor was maybe a necessary but not sufficient condition for being a commercial power. It was necessary because all trade was sea-based trade. If you didn't really have a good port, it was going to be hard to be a commercial power. But it wasn't sufficient because there were a number of potential good harbors in the area. Theirs became the harbor for a reason.
Yeah, and empirically, we were able to, again, the data, so whether you have a tyrant is not, we don't really see whether a polis actually had a tyrant. We just have, it's a T in our data set that meant someone said they did.
Right.
But what you do see is the polis on the coast were more likely to have a record of a tyrant.
Okay.
And so that probably means they were more likely to have a tyrant. And then those were also more likely later to become broad democracies. And so it's almost certainly the case that there's some relation there. And we do the best we can to control for things like the polis on the coast are better known. So there's more like, just because of better record keeping, you're more likely to record a tyrant conditional on having one. So we control just by how much space the inventory, basically how many columns of text there are on the inventory, so how much is known. And so that's how we've tried to look at that. But I think there's definitely a relationship. Exactly the nature remains open.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fleck and Dr. Hanssen. If you have any more particular questions or just want to chat with them, they'll be up here for a couple minutes, so feel free to do so. Also, if you didn't get any hot chocolate or cookies, it looks like this will help a lot.